April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifted off the pad and headed into space on a lunar mission. 2 days later, 199,990 miles in space from Earth, there was a crippling explosion and virtually a guaranteed death sentence for the 4 American astronauts aboard that spacecraft. Actor Tom Hanks portrayed Commander Jim Lovell in the 1995 film that told the story of Apollo 13.
Between Jim.
Hey, we've got a problem here.
What did you do?
Nothing. I stirred the tanks.
Whoa. Hey.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we have a problem. We have a main bus B undervolt. We've got a lot of thruster activity here, Houston.
Now?
It just went offline. Oh, there's another master alarm, Houston.
I'm checking the quad.
Christ, that was no repress valve.
Maybe it's in quad C.
We've got a computer
I'm
restart.
gonna reconfigure the RCS.
We've got a
When these
pink
things
light.
fire, it doesn't make any sense.
We've got multiple caution and warning, Houston. We've got a reset and restart.
All right, I'm going to SDS.
In 5 words, Commander Jim Lovell summed up the entire situation in saying, Houston, we have a problem. Romans chapter 3 could be summed up also in 5 words. Heaven, we have a problem. The problem is of even more dire circumstance and consequence. It is about we, humans, being on a trajectory toward eternal death because of sin and not having the resources to correct or to fix our frightening sentence of eternal death. Paul has explained in Romans chapter 2 how terrible sin is. It is a graphic description he has given. And he explains that just like the Apollo 13, where it was multiple system failure, and they couldn't come back to Earth because they didn't have enough oxygen and they didn't have enough fuel and they had low batteries and little water and a hole in the command module. Paul explained in Romans chapter 2, 24 different sins, and that wasn't the whole picture. And then he turns the page, or rolls the scroll, to Romans chapter 3, where he continues in what seems like an imaginary conversation in a philosophy class or a theology class. Paul is the professor, and he is imagining a student raising a hand and asking first one question and then another about what he has just taught. So question number 1, in verse number 1, asks the professor, what advantage then, if everybody's a sinner, what advantage then is there in being a Jew, or what value is there in circumcision? And Paul, the professor, answers his imaginary student saying, much in every way. First of all, they have been entrusted with the very words of God. So Paul has explained that everybody, whether a Jew or not, is equal before God, who shows no favorites. And the student wants to know, well, then what value is there to being a Jew? And Paul explains, well, Jews have had the Old Testament, the revelation of God. So then comes question number 2. What if some Jews did not have faith? Will their lack of faith nullify God's faithfulness? In other words, if God has chosen his people and they don't believe, does that somehow overrule God? And the professor answers, not at all. Let God be true and every man a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. When Jews refuse to believe in God and are condemned because of unbelief, it doesn't show that God is unfaithful to his people. No, what it shows, it just proves Paul's earlier point that God treats everybody the same, everyone fairly and equally. So then the theology student has one third question. It is a little more complex, and it is an intriguing and an inquisitive address to the professor. The imaginary student says, all right, if when we sin, it shows up the righteousness of God, when we are bad, it shows how good God is, then isn't sin a good thing? Isn't it good to make God look righteous? And the more I sin, the better that makes God look? So why would I get in trouble for sinning when it actually is to God's advantage? Or here's how the student asks it. But if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? I'm using a human argument. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Paul is, up to this point in this imaginary classroom, quite objective. But you can see his emotions begin to rise. And he starts to get worked up over it because it ties into a painful experience that he has had multiple times, where there have been those, apparently, in the Christian community who have said that what Paul does is encourage people to sin. He says, you know, God will forgive you, and therefore, no matter what you do, it will be forgiven. And therefore, they say, that Paul actually is a promoter of sin. He was sensitive to this. This was a touchy topic. It makes you wonder how St. Paul, who was the great theologian and New Testament writer, could be so misunderstood and so misinterpreted. And yet, in the first century, like in the 21st century, there are always those who will misrepresent what has been taught and what has been told. So Paul answers the student this time more with emotion than with argument. He fires back that this is absurd. He criticizes the critics, and he insists that everybody is a sinner, Jews and Gentiles, and that sin is always bad and that sin always deserves punishment. Here's the way he says it. Why not say, as we are being slanderously reported as saying, and as some claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is deserved. What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. What he writes next is really interesting because, you know, different people have different ways of learning. And what may be intriguing for one person just slides over the head of another. So maybe you or some of his readers really aren't much into philosophy or theology classes or intricate arguments, but you are a great believer in the authority of the Scripture. So what Paul does next is talk to others, and he rattles off a list of Old Testament quotations. They are not precise quotations. He apparently is quoting from memory, and he mixes them up, a piece from here and a piece from there. He quotes from Psalms and Ecclesiastes and Isaiah, all making his point about everybody being a sinner. It's in Romans 3, 10 to 18. He says, as it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands, no one who seeks God. All have turned away, they have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. So Paul, this time quoting from the Bible, sums up his teaching on sin, explaining that sin is sin. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you know God's law or don't know God's law. Which, of course, raises the question of what's the difference between those who know God's law and don't know God's law. It's kind of like when you're driving your car at 75 miles per hour, and you think that's probably breaking the law, but you say, wow, I haven't seen a speed limit sign in miles, so it's probably, could be okay. And then you go whizzing past this 55 mile per hour sign, and suddenly you know for sure that you are a lawbreaker, even though you were breaking the law before. And Paul explains in a moment in Romans chapter 3 that those who haven't yet seen the sign of God's law are lawbreakers just as much. But those who see the sign clearly understand what is God's law and the guilt that goes with breaking it. It's in verses 19 and 20. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in his sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. That's what the Old Testament law does. It's like that 55 mile per hour speed limit sign. We become conscious of what we are doing that's wrong. So Paul's point here is sin. He's saying in Romans 1 through 3 that we are all sinners. He has listed specific sins. He has given an intellectual academic argument. He has given quotations from the Old Testament scriptures. He has addressed some people with a whisper and some people with a shout. He's trying to make his point from every possible angle that heaven, we have a problem. We are deep into this sin, and we don't have a way out. Now, having set all that up, he comes to the solution. And the solution is found through faith. He starts out by explaining in verse 21 God's righteousness. But now, this is the answer, now a righteousness from God, apart from the law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. So this is big breakthrough news, that we cannot solve our own problem, but that God can intervene, and he does. That we can never make ourselves right with God, so God will make us right with him. That God has a rescue plan. That God will reach out into the space of our sin, and he will give to us righteousness that otherwise we couldn't get. And it's all, he explains in verse 22, through faith. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. So God offers to save us from sin. And faith is like the PIN number, the personal identification number. Think of it this way. It's as if we are eternally deep in debt. You have so much debt that there's not an outside chance that you could ever pay it off. In fact, if you take your best job, even multiple jobs, if you raise all the money you possibly can, you can't pay the minimum payment on the debt that you have. And worse yet, it's compounding out. So you owe so much money, and it's increasing even though you are putting everything you have into reducing that debt. So it's hopeless. And then God steps up and says, tell you what, you can have access to my bank account. And my bank account has everything that you will ever need in it. So all you need to do is withdraw out of my account and put it into your account. And you say, well, how do I do that? And God says, I'll tell you what, I will give you my PIN so that you can go to my account at an ATM machine, put in the PIN, and have open access to everything that I've got. And he explains that the pin is F-A-I-T-H. The pin is faith. So you say, all right, well, how does that actually work? And Paul explains that through two concepts, justification and sacrifice. He writes in verses 22 to 24, there is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. So the picture that Paul has, trying to explain these deep and profound concepts, is of a judge in a courtroom, and we are the defendants. And the case against us is absolutely overwhelming. There is virtually unlimited record of the sins that we have committed. So there's no doubt that we are guilty. And there isn't a lawyer in the universe that can present a credible defense, much less get us off. And then God, the judge, says, all right, I've considered the evidence, I've looked at the defendant, and the answer is, you are acquitted. You are justified. How can God do that? Because God knows that we're guilty, and yet he reckons us as righteous. And he does it by his grace, his undeserved generosity toward us, that God simply chooses to forgive all sin, to acquit us when we are obviously guilty. Now, on the face of it, that seems like awfully good news. It certainly is when you are the defendant. But to ancient Jews, this was offensive. Actually, to a lot of people in the world today, this is also offensive because they live in countries and in cultures where there are corrupt judges. So guilty people go to court and they get off. They get off because somebody pays a bribe. Or some of us have had this argument here in the United States. We can cite an example. You say, here's someone that went to trial for some heinous crime and was obviously guilty on the absolute face of it. And some judge, some jury let him off on a technicality. And we gripe and complain and gossip about that. How can you let someone so obviously guilty go free? How can you say not guilty when you know that they are guilty? So how can God do this? Is he a corrupt judge like legal systems frighteningly have? So Paul goes to a second explanation. He's talked about justification, that is the acquittal, and he next talks about sacrifice by blood. It's in verses 25 and 26. He says that God presented him, Jesus, as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice because in his forbearance he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his justice at the present time, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. He's explaining something that is detailed elsewhere in the New Testament, that when Jesus died on the cross, when he was sacrificed, when he bled, that he took the punishment, the consequences for our human sin. And that means that God is just, because the sin was punished. It's just the punishment went to Jesus. And when he acquits us, he is putting our sin onto Jesus' account and putting Jesus' righteousness over onto our account. So God can be fair and forgiving and just all at the same time. Paul explains that God had this in mind for a long time. That's why he let a lot of sin go unpunished, because he knew that Jesus was coming and that Jesus would be sacrificed. It is this brilliant plan of God, something only God himself ever could have thought up. And the way we get into this brilliant plan of God is through our pin. It's through F-A-I-T-H. and without putting in the pin, then all that God has done, as brilliant and sacrificial as it isn't access. God justifies those who have faith in Jesus. So it gets personal and it gets eternal. That if we punch in faith, then we are justified by God. And if we don't, then we're on our own in the judgment courtroom of God. Then all the evidence is presented against us, and we have to defend ourselves, and we will be found guilty forever. Paul finishes up this historic chapter by explaining how those who believe in Jesus are supposed to live after we have entered faith. He says it's not by boasting. That's not the way a follower of Jesus is going to live, because we have nothing to boast about. God's done all this for us. So it's not that we're any good, it's that he is totally amazing. And it's not by favoritism. There are no favorites. It doesn't make any difference whether someone is a Jew or a Gentile. It has nothing to do with race or gender or ethnicity or nationality or job or any of these usual qualifications. It's faith, just faith, nothing else, faith. And then, Paul explains, that we should then live by the laws of God as an expression of gratitude for what God has done for us. That is a really important teaching, because the law of God has shifted now in its purpose. It used to be that it was to show us that we don't measure up and that we are sinners. But once someone's sin has been forgiven, the law of God, the rules of God, are no longer to show us as sinners. That's not necessary. The rules and the laws of God are the way that we are to live to express gratitude to God, to show God that we are thankful for what he has done for us. One day, a group of boys were roaming around with nothing to do. And one of the older boys suggested that they do a prank that was really dangerous and clearly illegal. The youngest boy in the group declined, and he said he just wasn't going to go along with the rest of them. So one of the older boys taunted him to shame him into going along with the group. And he says, "Why aren't you going to do it? Come on, you can do it. What's the matter? Are you afraid that your dad will hurt you?" The young boy answered, "No, I'm afraid I'll hurt my dad." That's the difference of perspective that we have toward the law of God once we are Christians and followers of Jesus. Before we have faith, it is that we are afraid that God will hurt us in judgment. But once we have faith, then we have been reconciled to God. We have the righteousness of God. We are no longer in fear, but we do not want to hurt God. So that is why we don't lie, and we don't steal, and we don't gossip, and we don't create stress between people, and that's why we don't commit adultery, and that is why we put God first, and that's why we love our neighbor. We do all of those things because we don't want to hurt God, because we want to please him and honor him in everything that we do. Paul writes at the end of Romans 3, "Where then is boasting? It is excluded. On what principle? On that of observing the law? No, but on that of faith. For we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from observing the law. Is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too, since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through that same faith. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law as an act of gratitude and honor. We uphold and live by the law and the rules of God." Experts tell us that once you get your PIN number, what you shouldn't do is keep it in your wallet, and don't write it on the back of your ATM card. I once went to an auction where a very large safe had been taken out of a business office, and someone had taken a key and etched the combination to the safe in the paint on the front of the safe. That's not a good thing to do. So what you are supposed to do is once you get your pin, is put it in your head, put it in your heart, so that you always have access to it. Whenever you have any need for money or to transfer funds or whatever it is that comes up, you want to have your pin in your heart. And it is the same with the pin to God and his righteousness. It is Faithh, nothing more. It is not so much that it is written down, it is that it is memorized and central in our hearts. That everything is about living by faith. God, you have been extraordinary, and we are grateful. Listen now to our hearts. Look in them and see if we have faith. For those that do not, may today be the day that faith is written on hearts, belief in Jesus. And for those of us who have already entered faith, may we live by faith for Jesus' sake. Amen.